typically, the president finds an obscure subsection of a law
Yes.
that is often worded poorly,
Yeah.
and then tries to drive an entire semi-truck, a fleet of semi-trucks, through that little hole in order to accomplish his policy objectives.
So let's talk about your article on the recent Supreme Court case that came out of the summer. The court struck down a couple of EPA statutes. West Virginia versus EPA was the case, and you wrote about it and you said, administrative rules don't require broad consensus, so they don't enjoy the benefits of a diverse group's deliberations. Instead, they reflect the will of the president or administrators. But these rules are unstable because, as if controlled by a light switch, they can be undone by the next administration. I think I shared your concern with that quite a bit. I think as we've seen it the last couple of years, Trump undid a bunch of Obama's executive orders and flipped them on and put his own sort of the light switch that you're describing, and then Biden obviously comes in and shuts down a bunch of Trump's executive orders. And so we're getting into this stage where it's just executive order counters executive order, and one, that's not how government's supposed to function, but two, it places an undue pressure on the presidency, right? And so like you have to hold the presidency if you want your policy. There's no checks and balances here. But how do you see this playing out? How do you think that we can fix this? Where do you think that the correct, because you mentioned later that Justice Gorsuch said that there was a place for administrative powers in a modern government. Do you see those as he does? How do you see those powers playing into a correct regime?
Sure, thanks. I think one of the rallying cries of the conservative movement should be, and if I may hijack a phrase, is to make Congress legislate again.
Okay.
Make Congress legislate again. We have a system of separated powers, which you know if you've listened to Schoolhouse Rock.
Sure.
But the purpose of separating powers is not only to prevent bad government, but to enable good government.
Right.
The reason the Constitution vests all legislative power herein granted in the Congress at the federal level, in Congress, is because Congress is a bicameral legislature made up of ideologically and geographically diverse members, which means that the result of Congress's gridlock is deliberation and compromise.
Sure.
Which doesn't guarantee good laws, but it does suggest that the laws will be stable,
Yes.
more likely to be moderate,
Yep.
and more likely to protect minority rights.
Sure.
By contrast, what we see a lot, especially happening today, and especially since Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and then especially since the 1960s, is this alphabet soup of bureaucratic agencies
Sure.
who create rules, not laws.
Yes.
Rules.
That can be adjusted in the whim of the next president.
That can be adjusted,
Yes.
as you mentioned, that I mentioned, like a
Yeah.
light switch. The problem with this is that these rules are not stable.
Right.
They are often, they don't reflect the results of deliberation,
Right.
and they often don't take into account minority rights because they don't need to gain broad consensus. So we've seen this happen a few times, and just because he's the current president, with President Biden, who promulgated that rule requiring businesses with 100 or more employees to
vaccine mandate.
get the vaccines. This is not a law passed by Congress.
Sure,
it's
no.
just typically the president finds an obscure, unused, typically, subsection of a law
Yes.
that is often worded poorly,
Yeah.
and then tries to drive an entire semi-truck, a fleet of semi-trucks, through that little hole in order to accomplish his policy objectives.
Yeah.
So the OSHA case is an example of this, but also President Barack Obama's, I think it's called the Clean Power Plan of 2015 is another example of this.
Do you think, and there's obviously the phrase, as the founders were describing or laying out the balance of powers, the separation of powers, there's the phrase, ambition should be made to counteract ambition. Do you think they foresaw a world in which Congress, well, because I think the big reason we're in this problem is because Congress is really intentionally, like, they're happy to let the agencies legislate for them because that means that they're not going to be controversial. They're going to be able to stay in power more easily. They don't have to work across the aisle. Do you think the founders foresaw that future? Because I think that it seems hard for me to understand if Congress isn't interested in reclaiming their own power. It seems very hard for me to understand how we're going to get out of this mess.
That's right. And you're pointing to a key problem here. Congress has the institutional incentive to pass the buck onto the president.
Yes.
And so they can pass vaguely worded aspirational laws.
Yes.
And then just sort of, it's 4th and 25, and so they punt.
Yes.
They've punted to the president. And then they get to celebrate their monumental achievements on social media. There have been a few examples of senators and other representatives like checking their Twitter feed right after they deliver a speech.
Yes. The Senate, do you think that the Senate is just basically a staging grounds, or like a preparatory field for presidential campaigns?
Well,
testing grounds?
Right. Well, it shouldn't be.
No,
right?
no, it definitely shouldn't be.
What do we do?
Yes.
And I'm actually very hopeful.
Okay.
Especially after this recent court's term, the West Virginia versus EPA case. Chief Justice Chief Justice John Roberts,
Yes.
the lesser John,
Yes.
but still, admirable, but the lesser John.
Yep.
He renounced the majority opinion, and he says this is a major questions case, which communicates the expectation that when an agency promulgates a rule of economic or political or social significance, that we expect the authorizing legislation to speak very clearly about that.
Yep.
So you're right. Congress does not have the institutional incentive to actually legislate at the moment. I think a key part to helping Congress reclaim its ambition is the court, which has the fortitude of independence. It has the fortitude that comes from being independent. And so the court can teach Congress how to do its job.
Yeah.
By saying, you need to write this more clearly.
Yeah.
If you want the agency to interpret it in that way.
Clearly our governmental structure has shifted and changed much in some difficult ways from the way that the founders intended it. But I think also our personal and the way that we interact as individuals has changed, but I think that a lot of the principles are very much the same. So if you want to hear about Dr. Griffith's take on Alexis de Tocqueville and how its themes play out in Only Murders in the Building, click right here to check out that conversation.